What's up, you guys? My name is Aubrey and this is my channel, and today we're going to be talking about the PPP. More specifically, I'm going to be breaking down how you should spend your PPP in order to ensure forgiveness. Now, even though the PPP has expired for most borrowers, it's still important to know where and how you should spend it in order to ensure that the money is considered to be free money. So in this video, I'm going to be breaking down exactly what expenses are considered eligible and which ones are considered ineligible. So let's get started. So last week, I made a video outlining the steps that you should take after you get the PPP in order to ensure forgiveness. Now, that was a video more so talking about the steps that you should take, things like getting organized, hiring an accountant, things like that. Now, I will include a link to that video down in the description below, but in this video, we're really going to be concentrating on where to spend the money. But if you pair the tips that I'm going to be talking about in this video mixed with the tips that I talked about in the last video, then you really will be setting yourself up for success when it comes to forgiveness. Now, the PPP loan is the Paycheck Protection Loan, and as you guys know, I'm sure, the PPP loan is forgivable as long as you spend the money in the way in which it was intended to be spent. So as long as you spend the money on eligible expenses and you spend it on eligible things, then you don't have to pay any of it back. Whatever funds are not spent on eligible expenses do need to be repaid. So because of that, it is incredibly important to have an understanding of where these funds need to go and how you need to spend the funds. That way you don't have to worry about ever paying those funds back, which can be huge for a small business, solo entrepreneur, or business owner. Now with that, let's dive right in and dig into the nitty-gritty of what you should and should not do when it comes to spending PPP funds. So the first thing that you need to know is the fact that 60% of your PPP funds need to be spent on payroll. So if you have a business, if you are a solo entrepreneur, at least 60% of that money, the total money that you received, has to be spent on payroll costs. Now, if you own a business with employees, this could simply just be your weekly or monthly payroll cost, however you handle payroll. If you are a solo entrepreneur, then it could be what you pay yourself. If you don't do payroll and you just kind of take money from your business, then that can be in the form of owner compensation replacement. The way in which you go about using this money as payroll, it can vary depending on how your business is structured, how many employees you have, how you typically pay you and your staff. But what is important to know here is that you have to spend at least 60% on the funds on this expense. If you do not spend at least 60% of the funds on payroll, then the amount of the funds that will be forgiven will be proportionally scaled back in comparison to what you didn't spend on payroll. If you don't end up spending at least 60% of the funds on payroll, then whatever you didn't spend on payroll will end up getting taken out of the forgiveness aspect of the equation, and you will end up having to pay back that proportionate amount of funds. So we know that 60% of the funds have to be spent on payroll, but what about the additional 40% that now is unaccounted for? Well, these funds can be spent in a variety of different places, but they are still very specific on where they can and cannot be spent. So first and foremost is rent. These funds can be used to pay for rent. More specifically, this includes any fees paid for any vehicle, equipment, or building whose lease date falls before February 15th, 2020. So as long as you leased out a space or a building or a piece of equipment before February 15th, 2020, then you can use the PPP in order to pay off that lease payment or that rent payment. The second place where you can spend these funds is mortgage interest payments. More specifically, interest payments paid on mortgage debt that was taken out before February 15th, 2020. The next place is utilities. This includes things like water, electricity, gas, cable, internet. And once again, the caveat here is that the agreement for these utility services had to have been made prior to February 15th, 2020. In addition to rent, mortgage interest payments, and utilities, you can also spend these funds on worker protection. So basically anything that you need to buy for yourself or for your team that could provide them with protection in order to complete their job more adequately. This would also include things like PPE, things like masks, things like goggles, something to help with COVID-19, as well as just general protective equipment like hard hats, for example. You can use the PPP funds on these things without issue. In addition, you can also use these funds on supplier costs as long as the supplier is necessary in order to keep operating your business business. So if it's something that isn't considered a necessity, it's not really needed for your business to operate, then you could potentially be towing the line of not getting that portion of the loan forgiven. But if it's a supplier that you need in order to keep your business running, for example, if you have a restaurant and you have like a food or a drink supplier, that would be a supplier that you could use the PPP funds for. But in addition to having it be a supplier that is a necessity for your business, it also has to be a supplier who you signed a contract with before you received your PPP loan. So for example, you couldn't get the PPP loan and then after that sign a supplier contract with a new supplier. It has to be a supplier that you had a relationship with prior to the PPP loan, regardless of when you received that PPP loan. Next is operating expenses. Now this is, in my opinion, probably the most broad category of any of the PPP requirements. According to the SBA, operating expenses can be things like accounting, cloud computing software, HR services, and more. But to be honest, I think that this is very, very broad, and I think that there are a lot of things that could be considered operating expenses. Some cookie cutter examples would be things like a QuickBooks subscription, a subscription to some sort of other accounting software. If you use like a CRM for your business, that would be another example. There are a lot of different places that you could put operating expenses into. And then lastly is property damage costs that occurred in 2020 but was not covered by your insurance. Now this is one that I've always felt to be a bit nervous about because I think it's almost a bit too broad. What do they mean by 2020 damage that occurred to your property that wasn't covered under insurance? Is it like protest damage? Is it like natural disaster damage? Is it just damage from things like a burst pipe or something that wasn't working well in your building? Like, what is the details of that? And to be honest, I am not 100% sure. So if I was you, I probably would not put a lot of your eggs into the basket of property damage. But if you absolutely have to spend your PPP fund on property damage, then absolutely do so. But just make sure that you have a lot of documentation to prove that it happened in 2020 and that your insurance would not cover the funds. Now, remember, when it comes to the PPP, it's not only important as to where you spend the funds, but you also need to spend them in a specific amount of time as well. And you have 24 weeks from the day that you received the funds in order to spend all the funds where they need to be spent. So for example, if you receive the funds and then you spend $1,000 on that 25th week after the 24-week deadline, then that means that $1,000 will not be forgiven and you will have to pay that $1,000 back. So it does have to be spent in a 24-week window. The other thing that I would like to note is the fact that this is not an all or nothing forgiveness, meaning that if you screw up on one thing, it doesn't mean that the entire forgiveness is shot and you're not going to have to pay it all back. Anything that isn't considered to be a forgivable and eligible expense means that it will just be taken away from the total forgiveness of the loan. So for example, if you received a $10,000 PPP loan and you spent $8,000 on forgivable expenses, but $2,000 was spent on non-forgivable and non-eligible expenses, then you would not have to pay back that entire $10,000. You would only have to pay back the $2,000 that you spent on non-eligible and non-forgivable expenses. Another piece of criteria is the fact that you do have to retain the same amount of employees that you had prior to the pandemic and prior to receiving your PPP loans. But there are a few caveats to this. Number one is the fact that I'm sure all of us know that there is quite a big staffing issue right now. A lot of people are not returning to work for a various number of reasons that I won't get into in this video, but there is a big staffing issue that a lot of businesses are struggling to hire workers. And so because of that, there are a lot of businesses that have received PPP funds. They're trying to get their staff count up and they're not able to because they can't find workers. If this is the case, this will not affect your forgiveness. You will just need to document the fact that you offered workers their jobs back. You offered workers a place to work and they simply declined. You will need to have that on record and you will need to have that documented in order to ensure that you don't have your employee count counted against you when it comes to forgiveness. And lastly, not only do you have to rehire the same number of workers, or at least attempt to rehire the same number of workers, you also have to pay the workers at least 75% of what they were making before. So you can't hire back all the same workers and then give them a 50% pay cut and then take the rest of that money home to you. They have to be making 75% or more of what they were making before COVID-19 and before the pandemic hit. If you're not able to prove this and you're not able to produce the receipts to show that you've been paying this, then that will affect your forgiveness as well. Now, all in all, I understand that PPP forgiveness can be something that is daunting daunting, and it can be something that can feel like a very tedious, very confusing task. But the fact is, as long as you keep an eye on where you're spending the money, and as long as you document every step of the way, PPP forgiveness should be fairly straightforward. In fact, soon I will be going through the process of applying for forgiveness for my own PPP loan, and whenever I go through the process of doing that, I will be sure to document every step of the way, and I will publish it on this YouTube channel so that you guys can learn from my own experience. But once again, if you guys are interested in checking out the tips that I have on what you should do after receiving the PPP loan, this does not cover where you should spend the loan, just simply the steps that you should take, then check out the video that I will have down in the comment section below. But like always, if you have any questions, comments, if you have anything to add, I would love to hear your thoughts, so make sure to leave a comment down below. And while you guys are at it, make sure to hit the like button, hit that subscribe button, and hit the notification bell, and I will see you guys in the next video.